evening. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, I'd like to welcome each of you here to this evening's presentation on The Dark Night of the Soul, Tragedy and Suffering in the Life of the Faith. Tonight's speakers, Jenell Paris and Janel Kragt Bakker, were introduced to each other some years ago by a mutual friend. Through that introduction, they discovered that they shared a similar experience of loss, as well as a complementary disciplinary and research interests. These similar pathways led to their joint desire to examine the religious dimensions of parents' bereavement. Jenell Paris is professor of anthropology at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania. Prior to her faculty assignment at Messiah, she taught at Bethel University in St. Paul, where some years earlier she received her B.A. in Cultural Studies. Jenell later received her Ph.D. in Cultural Anthropology from American University in Washington, D.C. Jenell is currently a resident scholar at the Collegeville Institute, where she lives with her husband James and their 3 children. She and her family will be on campus with us through the end of the semester. And Janel Kragt Bakker is Associate Director of the Collegeville Institute. Jenell grew up in the Tampa Bay area, attended college in the Midwest, and spent most of the last 13 years in the Washington, D.C. area. She obtained her master's and doctoral degrees in religion and culture from the Catholic University of America, and she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in religious practices and practical theology at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. Her background is in teaching, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as elementary and high school. Jenell and her husband, Laren, live in St. Joseph with their 2 young children, Aaliyah and Reuben. Just a couple notes, housekeeping tips about tonight. After Jenell and Janel's presentation, we'll have some time for conversation and discussion and questions and answers. And because we are recording this presentation, we'd like for you to come up and use the mic and the stand here for any comments or questions that you might have. And so with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jenell Paris and Janel Kragt Bakker.
Okay, I apologize. Okay. And so on the one hand, our topic is very specific, and it may be something that you connect to in your own experience or your family, or it may not be. But in a broader sense, the issues of suffering and grief and lament and tragedy and faith are issues that hopefully we all can connect to. And that's where we really want to focus tonight. I'm going to present the social science research part of it, and all sound a little bit like a sociology journal. So I'm talking through our paper. And then Janelle's going to talk about implications for the church and for the life of faith. And hopefully in all of that, there will be multiple points of contact that will give us things to talk about afterward. So I come from the discipline of anthropology. Janelle's from religious studies. And we found compatibility in that, and our research is actually being published in, so this article is done and written and accepted, and it's coming out in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, which we're very excited about. And it was a So it was a project that blended our interests, blended our areas of expertise. And so what I'm going to do is talk for a while about the data gathering and our findings, and then Janelle will come up after that and talk about implications. So this research is about what happens to parents, what happens in parents' faith and spiritual lives following bereavement of a very, very young baby. So babies who are born still or who die very shortly after birth. Stillbirth is actually more common in the United States than deaths due to AIDS and viral hepatitis combined. There's about 27,000 stillbirths in the United States. You may not hear about them as much. Often we don't hear about them as much. Globally, about 3 to 4 million stillbirths a year. And on a global level, stillbirth is actually a really good indicator of maternal health. And so the fact that those rates are so high globally is an indicator of other issues related to poverty and hunger. Our work is focused in the United States because our data came from people who write online, which is overwhelmingly first world and literate people. But we kept that kind of broader global context in mind. Stillbirth and infant loss, as well as miscarriage for that matter, are often referred to as ambiguous losses. Sometimes they're called pregnancy loss, sometimes they're called reproductive loss, neither of which even register that it's a loss of a person. It's more than the loss of a pregnancy. It's a loss of a person. And it gets categorized in the literature often as ambiguous loss, which is frustrating for the person who's experienced the loss. It's not ambiguous at all to them. But people who lose a beloved pet, people who lose a dream, maybe people who have someone who loses a mistress, sometimes couples who had long-term pairings that weren't acknowledged or maybe weren't even known in their communities. Those kinds of loss are severe and deep, but they're ambiguous because they're not known, recognized, or validated by society in the same way that they are by the person experiencing it. And so there's a challenge there to validating, perceiving, counting, and understanding what people go through in these types of losses. So in our research, we do a literature review where we looked at social science research on bereavement. We looked at overlap literature on bereavement and religion. And there's a lot of discussion in the social science community about whether or not religion is real in any sense beyond its social reality, and whether it's a help or a hindrance in grief and coping. And so we delved into that literature and tried to make the case, ultimately, that religion maybe can be sometimes helpful and can sometimes be a hindrance, and that but that it should be talked about in a fuller way than merely a coping mechanism. It's a worldview, it's a daily practice, it's a much bigger thing than simply a tool for coping with life's difficulties, although hopefully it is that as well. And then we also looked at religion online, and that was a part of Janelle's doctoral work, that a line of research that I hadn't looked at before, about what the internet is in people's religious lives. The internet is a new social context for grief. It gives people new opportunities for accessing resources, being in touch with others, constructing a presentation of the self and of the deceased. New dimensions of grief or memorialization of people are happening online. There was recently a case about Facebook about people wanting access to their deceased loved ones' online materials because that's a part of who they are and can that be released. So all of these things are just unfolding, and we're negotiating them as they unfold. Both in infant loss and neonatal loss and ambiguous loss, the internet has provided a really new context for grieving. People seek relationship, care, connection, even intimate communication in online communication. I'm going to read you a paragraph about online religion. Cyberspace is largely continuous with real life, but the constructed and pluralistic nature of religious expression is heightened online. The internet user is exposed to a fluid doctrinal environment that encourages individual religious and spiritual experimentation above adherence to the truth claims of a particular religious authority. It caters to people who wish to be religious and spiritual on their own terms. We'll see that play out in our data as well. Those alienated by social or ideational strictures of institutionalized religion may relate to online communities as safe spaces for expressing struggle or dissent. So we argue that we should study religion online because we need to study religion as it actually happens in people's lives, not only in a church, not only in a set of ideas, but in people's actual social and lived experience. And Heidi Campbell is one of the leading researchers of religion online. So I'll talk briefly about methods. We go on at great length in the paper about this, but I'll briefly describe to you what we did. So we used a website called Glow in the Woods, which is a major kind of hub website for bereaved parents, people with reproductive challenges of a variety of kinds, people on adoption journeys, people having pregnancies after loss, kind of a whole pool of experiences. But one of the main ones is infant loss and stillbirth. And so we looked at the people who post there. There's some sort of core people who post, and then there's many people who can blog or discuss issues in comment threads. It's that kind of a community website. So we looked over that website for themes related to grief and faith. That's only one of many things that people talk about on the site. And so we found 148 parents who had written entries on the site that related to grief and faith. We defined faith as broadly as we could. So we used a definition of religion broad enough to include Buddhism, agnosticism, atheism even. So people's sort of total view of the cosmos and what life means. When those things were upset by grief and they were processing it, we included it. So it was multi-religious, including both men and women. This is more than you necessarily need to take in, obviously, but it describes the characteristics of the participants in this study. We couldn't always tell because we didn't contact them. So to the extent that they identified themselves online, that was what we knew about them. Overwhelmingly female, which is the case in in reproductive loss discussions online. It just is more women, but we didn't want to exclude men for that reason, and we didn't want this to be a discussion only of women's grief or women's religious experience. We thought the parent characteristic is most important, and so we included men even though they were a small minority. Type of loss, stillbirth, neonatal death, pretty evenly balanced. Some were multiples, most were singletons. I think there were only a handful of multiples. Some people had living children at the time of their loss. Some people went on to have living children. Some people didn't. Some people adopted. So very different journeys through that experience of loss. Religious affiliation, mostly Christian and a variety of types of Christians. But we look for representation from lots of other categories as well. Oops, I'm going to back up to the methods. So we collected all of these entries, and then we used a qualitative approach to data analysis. So we developed codes, and then we went back. It's called iterative code development. So we went back and forth saying, I think I see 4 or 5 major themes, and then she would go over a subset of the data and alter the codes and pass it back to me. We went back and forth 6 or 7 times until we developed a set of codes or categories that we then subjected all of the data to. Then we compared her findings with my findings, negotiated differences until we had a really high intercoder reliability rate. So that was how we tried to establish a reliable coding of this big pool of data. What that gave us in the end was a set of themes. And so we said, all of these stories, all of these phrases, here are some themes that we see in there that relate to this question of how parent bereavement influences faith and religion. these were the 4 themes we found, and so I'm just obviously going to talk through these 4 themes. We saw religious disorientation, religious reorientation, a quest for meaning, and changed relationships with others. So I'll describe each of these themes to you and then talk about some of the implications of them. For each one, we include participant voices. So we have quotes included in the paper, and we only have a few included here. But each time I show you a theme, I'll pause for a moment and let you read, and then I'll talk a little more broadly about that theme. So the first theme is religious disorientation. About 40% of the parents described a crisis or a disturbance in their religious lives after their baby's death. People said their faith was shaken, lost, shattered. One woman wrote, "I find that the ideas I had about life, about religion and spirituality, about things beyond or unseen, have all been scattered and broken open to reveal a deep sense of unknowing." Most parents interpreted this kind of crisis very negatively, that it was a falling, it was a breaking, it was a shattering, interpreted it and experienced it in very negative terms. A lot of anger, a lot of rage. A lot of that focused on unmet expectations. People went into a pregnancy with the expectation that God or the divine or the sacred or the universe would protect them, and that their religious or faith practices would help keep them safe, and and that their prayers or their supplications would have a result. That not happening was a deep sense of disappointment, and then wondering, then what does my faith mean if it's not going to help my child? One mother wrote, "I am a faithful person, and I try to put my faith in God, but I feel so desperately that he let me down when my baby died." So unmet expectations, feeling betrayed, unsafe, let down by God. Parents often voiced their religious disorientation with very strong emotion, preeminently anger and rage, not uncommonly expressed with curse words or with violence. A Catholic woman wrote, "I wanted to punch God in the face for letting this happen. And in the beginning, I felt and I said I hated him." And we'll discuss this a little later, but the online environment seems particularly well suited to venting that kind of anger. People are saying things in a space that has been designated as understanding and supportive. People have shared experience. They can bring some of those really difficult emotions there in a way that they can't in their offline life. I think I need help bringing the screen back. Yeah, I don't know what happened. It just timed out. I think God didn't like me reading that quote about punching him in the face. He's over there. We're not going to have any more of that. Should I just carry on?
I think let's carry on and
Yeah.
we think it's late.
Okay.
Sure.
I'll just keep talking until something happens. Okay. So for some people, this kind of disorientation moved them out of their tradition, put them at odds with their local church, put them at odds with their whole religion or tradition, and other times it didn't. Theme number 2 is religious reorientation. So we saw this disorientation over time give way to a new way of being. We saw people describing their faith over time in a way that, or a way of relating to transcendence that felt more stable, sometimes having less anger and doubt, sometimes being able to handle ongoing anger and doubt in a way that it couldn't before. These parents developed new insights, practices, and ways of relating with organized religion and the tradition they came from. Thank you. One thing we noticed about reorientation was its time frame. It was years long and very different for different individuals, but a very long, multi-year process from point of loss to a point of feeling a new kind of normal or a new kind of stabilization in their religion. People describe practices, some of the most helpful practices, as being very personal, like writing, listening, being in nature. Reoriented religious identities, for the most part, did not reconcile the question of why the baby died or whether God or the cosmos was at fault. People seem to reorient themselves around supportive groups or individuals, broader virtues like love and joy, and much less about doctrine or explanation. A third theme we found was a quest for meaning. We found about more than half of the parents describing a quest for meaning, either saying, what did the baby's life mean? What did the baby's death mean? What does my life mean now that I'm living without my baby? So those kinds of questions of meaning. We read parents discussing purpose and meaning with ambivalence. The baby's life should not be meaningless, but at the same time, claims to meaning can sound trivial, as if the reason justified the death. Additionally, the idea of post-traumatic growth can create pressure to heal, to become a better person, or to get over the loss. So post-traumatic growth is good, but it shouldn't be necessary. It doesn't justify the loss. Don't think that this means it wasn't that big of a deal just because I'm getting better now. So a lot of tension and ambivalence about moving forward and reestablishing meaning. One woman said, the way I see it, we move forward because we have to, putting one foot in front of the other. Sometimes what we become in the aftermath is stronger and more beautiful than before, but to me that's not a reason and it's not an obligation. One of the most common ways that people came to see meaning in the life of their baby over time was that the baby was a blessing or a gift. Sometimes very, very specific, that people saw certain circumstances or resolutions to issues in their lives as linked to that event, and so the baby was a gift that helped this other thing happen. A final theme in the quest for meaning was people coming to embrace religious traditions in a different way, often sort of on their own terms, with redefined practices or redefined meanings to common symbols. So an ownership that's very personal and very almost individualized, drawing down the tradition in the specificity of their story. And the fourth theme is changed relationships with others. More than half the parents described altered relationships with others in their lives, including others in their religious communities and just other people in their lives. A lot of anger vented in online settings about offline interactions. You'll never believe what my sister just said to me. You'll never believe what I heard in church. People really relied on that space and predictably would receive affirmation in comments. Yeah, that happened to me too. Yeah, that sounds really hard. And that was a unique part of the online setting that you could tell people were really relying on. People complained that highly religious people were the most offensive because they were quick to explain and quick to say who God was and what God was doing. When it comes to church people, they just don't get it. Since my son died, it's the godly and religious who have said the dumbest, meanest, stupidest shit to me. I actually find the insensitive things people say almost always clothed in pseudo-spirituality. Parents would be offended by sort of quick and easy explanations coming from others, like, oh, God just really needed an angel. Oh, God won't give you more than you can handle. You know, bumper stickers, things that people say. Parents were also offended by positive things that happened to other people, like someone else saying, I prayed so hard during my pregnancy, and look what God gave me, this miracle. So positive attributes, you know, other events being attributed to God, people would read that back into their grief, even if that wasn't explicitly being talked about. A less prevalent theme was positive engagement with others, and at times people found a lot of help from people in their churches or pastors, often around support, encouragement, presence, listening, much more so than the talking or explaining. So those were our 4 themes. A couple of implications, and then Janelle will talk about applications. Suffering and tragedy are major meaning-making events in people's lives, and we see that across types of tragedy or loss. We see that across cultures as well. Expressing grief and recomposing life is a monumental task. We're not proposing a stage theory that people go through certain steps in a certain order or in a certain amount of time. We're just describing contours of a process that involve people's view of themselves, of the world, of the cosmos, and their social relationships. We found that in this context, first world American context, religion often insufficiently incorporates rage and anger. Contemporary religions often don't hold anger and rage in very close association with love and affection. So parents saw feelings of anger, rage, and betrayal as signs that their faith had weakened. Faith seems to be focused on acceptance, peace, and love. And so the so-called negative emotions must be diffused or eliminated before a life of faith can resume. Also, parents seem to share a widespread expectation that faith is an asset in preventing personal tragedy. This expectation exacerbates crises of faith that many parents experienced. We also found a strong value to online support networks, allowing parents to meet others with similar losses, especially, and we find this with different kinds of life experiences, things that are statistically rare, where you don't find very many people in your local context who have experienced what you're going through. The internet has been an amazing resource to find, to link up with others, to find validation and safety, to share coping strategies, to be a declared safe space that really works that way, where people can process and vent some of the most difficult parts of grief that they're not finding support for in their offline relationships. And so we found that to be an important element as well. We end the paper with a statement of limitations. Our study has all kinds of limitations, which we try to acknowledge and point forward to other work that could be done. And it also ends with a really long list of references that we would be happy to share with you if you're interested in the literature that this links up with. So that's the end of my portion. Now Janelle's going to talk about broader applications.
So as Janelle mentioned, we'd like to take this into a conversation, an ecumenical conversation, particularly in a Christian context, about what this type of research might mean for how we do faith in community. And as Carla alluded to briefly, Janelle and I have also experienced stillbirth or neonatal loss personally. So our own journeys of faith plays into this, as well as the stories from our research subjects and our theological training. So first of all, one of the applications that we talked about, and again, this isn't related to our research, it's just instigating further thoughts and discussion, but questioning the notion of faith as an asset in preventing personal tragedy. And this is something that a lot of people, might not say overtly that they believe, that my faith keeps me safe, but it seems to be in the water of religious life, particularly in North America. And so this notion that my faith didn't keep me safe, that something really bad happened to me, that something happened to my child, and I couldn't perform my first parental duty and instinct to protect my child, can be shattering to people. And a lot of it is based in this notion that somehow having faith keeps me safe, or that God is going to prevent some sort of suffering. So there's this illusion of safety that a lot of religious people share. And then secondly, related to that, is a culture in which death is frequently evaded and denied. It's not something we like to think about. We don't like to think about it happening to us or our loved ones, especially people at a young age. And so reminding ourselves that all creatures die, we are all creatures, and that our lives are finite is also not something that a lot of cultures of Christian faith in the United States share. Another application is how we image God. And often God is imaged for practical purposes as a sort of puppet master, calling the shots, arranging events. And I think our own stories, as well as the stories that we found from the research that we did, that many people found the image of God as a co-sufferer to be much more compelling than the image of God as puppet master. And that when you start to think, if your life is going pretty well, you can imagine God as puppet master. God gave me this job, God gave me this parking spot, God gave me this spouse. But when tragedy strikes, sometimes people will say, well, that taught me a lesson, so God was using this, God was making these events to teach me a lesson. But I think that only goes so far. And when somebody experiences deep tragedy or suffering, that comes up insufficient, because suddenly God is sadistic, even evil, and becomes very problematic for how people envision God. Christians are often encouraged to believe or to contend that God gave them their suffering. This is sometimes because God teaches us a lesson or gives us an opportunity to sacrifice or to fulfill some sort of unknown plan. But for bereaved parents, the idea that the child would just be collateral damage in this process is also very offensive. Or if God needed another baby, get your own baby. Why are you taking mine? That God would kill a baby in order to teach the parent a lesson is something that many bereaved parents find very offensive. And so then it calls into question some of these common theological categories, that suffering happens for a reason, that there is some sort of purpose, that God is giving us the suffering or even allowing the suffering for some purpose of growth or to bring events together in some sort of mastering way. This makes God seem cruel, petty, or vindictive to people who are suffering. Also, if we look at Jesus' response to suffering, in the Gospels, we see sadness and solidarity rather than triumphalism. The bereaved need affirmation that the life they mourn was valuable and that grief is appropriate. And again, when the grief or the event is portrayed as somehow necessary or planned, then it can often shortcut or invalidate people's grief. And finally, envisioning God as co-sufferer gives us a model ourselves for how to respond to other people's grief, so that we can also join other people's grief as co-sufferers ourselves. A third application that we discussed is recognizing crises of faith and negative emotions as normal reactions to loss and as potentially constructive. And that, Janelle mentioned that it seems like people's religious constructs or worldviews in many cases weren't capable of holding these strong negative emotions, but that these negative emotions are a sign that there was love and that there was a breach of a strong relationship. And so these negative emotions can lead in constructive directions, and they're not just necessarily deconstructive. And we saw this with the reorientation of people's religious lives. So that even though there was religious disorientation, there was also new ways of being religious, new insights, new patterns, new practices. We also, before I move on to the last point, looking at the example of the Psalms and other books of poetry in the scriptures, we see that there's a long tradition of lament that often is not incorporated into our liturgies, is not incorporated into people's individual prayers. And so there's a long precedence historically for lament, for fist pounding, being a part of people's religious experience. And too often in contemporary circles, this sense of lament is lost. Experiences of deep loss often profoundly reorient life. Old formulations, presuppositions are no longer adequate, but people can learn how to sing a new song. And these negative emotions can be a pathway for people learning how to sing that new song. Christian communities would do well to reduce the fear that feelings of anger and betrayal are opposed to faith, and instead honor grievers' full range of experience. And finally, bereaved should be encouraged to grieve boldly as an expression of love. You know, often related to any sort of loss, we'll ask, well, how is that person doing? And if they're, happy or if they're smiling, then they're doing well. If they're angry or they're crying or they're unhappy, then they're not doing well. And instead, to honor the range of grieving experiences as an expression, again, of love. And so grieving to be a normal process rather than something that we perceive as a pathology. Finally, suspending resolution, one of the applications that we believe comes out of our own experience as well as hinted at in the stories of these parents on Glow in the Woods who expressed their journeys of faith online. So first of all, a community's focus, particularly in a Christian context, on resurrection or a pressure to move too quickly toward resolution can alienate the bereaved and trivialize their loss. So even at funerals, if the whole funeral is around the theme of resurrection, often that can just give the bereaved a sense of alienation. They're not feeling resurrection. Resurrection may somehow come in some way, but jumping too quickly to resurrection can be problematic. And again, in the gospel narratives, Holy Saturday can be a motif that can be very important to people, a time of darkness, of silence, of absence, and this being part of the Christian journey and not just death to resurrection. Bereaved are often more comforted by others' shared sense of sadness and suffering than they are about statements of God's will, purpose, or plan. And as Janelle mentioned, this came through very clearly in our research, that people didn't want answers. Answers were uniformly unsatisfactory. Instead, shared comfort, shared sadness, a shared sense of grief, even a shared sense of anger as something that really resonated with bereaved parents. The Christian virtue of hope, we believe, is based on God transforming even the worst of circumstances, not a declaration that God needed those circumstances or willed those circumstances. The bereaved also may need others, people in the community, to sustain hope for them in times of crisis and doubt. And this is where we think, based on our own experiences especially, that there is beauty in Christian community, that hope need not be sustained necessarily by every individual at every time, but that various people in a community can help bring hope when others are incapable of expressing or experiencing hope. And finally, to the extent that there is beauty and redemption in the world, and Christians believe that there is, this does not erase loss. Our hope is that God's Spirit still moves and that life can still be blessed even though loss has occurred. So we'd like to see a more integrative trajectory of beauty and redemption alongside suffering rather than a need to move from suffering to redemption. So at this point, we'd like to open up a conversation We hope that you'll feel free to express comments or questions, and just to continue on with the conversation that we've started with our presentation. And if you could please use the microphone just so that it can be on the recording.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Janelle, number one, talked about this a little bit about, I think the word she used was, most religious people were sometimes, their comments were the hardest. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering in the website, of people who are suffering from a serious challenge to their personal faith, whether they felt supported by, if they were involved with a religious institution that had pastors, priests, whether they felt supported in their questioning of their own faith, or whether the idea that they were in a crisis of faith was somehow exacerbated by the responses they were getting from their spiritual leaders. Was that one of the sub-themes, or were there any things you noticed in going over their comments on that front?
I mean, we found a small minority of people who found their churches to be really helpful and said, in this loss, I fell more in love with God. I don't question God's ways. I mean, people, and we questioned also just the nature of different websites. I think that there probably are religious communities online that would lean toward one interpretation more than another. This website was multi-religious, so people already had a tolerance for difference and for not always having shared understanding or agreement. And it seemed to have a really high tolerance for anger and questioning and that kind of thing. So we would need to look at more than one website, I think, to say that. But I mean, I think we read more alienation or frustration. And I think it's just going to a Sunday service where everyone's doing things the same way. My life has changed, and that's not, that's painful. And then hearing negative comments or blithe comments from even a few others then creates a hesitation or a fear that that's the dominant way in that community. I mean, a lot of people describe serious distancing from particularly the formal parts of religion, from the ritual, from the authority figures, and then saying, well, I found my own way in nature, I found my own way in journaling, I found my own conversation with a friend, really carving out very individual ways that, that still might be related to the church. And an exception to that would be some people found a lot of support in familiar rituals that come with the cycle of a year. So some people found a lot of comfort in predictable observance of Easter, a predictable observance of Dia de los Muertos was another one. So sometimes there was a lot of helpfulness there.
And I think for many folks too, even being surrounded by pregnant women, by baptisms, the majority of these parents were Christian, so you're getting all the Advent motifs about, expectation with pregnancy. Many of the stories of the Bible involve infertile women going on to give birth to healthy babies, who become these amazing figures of faith. So often it was the motifs of faith as well as just being on the outside of other people's experiences. But as Janelle said, there were certainly a few who really resonated with something their pastor said, but for many, the experience of worship itself was very painful.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure if I missed it or if you mentioned what time period that you looked at this website, over how long of a time period was it?
It was 4 years. So we looked at every entry. The website started in 2008. So we looked at every possible entry that had been posted on the website since it was founded.
Okay. And over that time, I know you weren't looking for defining any stages that people move through, but did you notice people moving from one of those 4 stages you outlined to another?
Well, that was also kind of difficult about our research because, the only data we had is what people gave us. So, we didn't solicit any interviews, et cetera. Right. And we did find that most people's losses was relatively recent within the past year. There were some people who were writing on there, even a dozen years after a stillbirth or an infant death. But it was really, that was a variable we, from our referees too, we got some criticism about. We need to know more about what people are like 2 years after loss or 5 years after loss. But the way our methodology didn't lend itself to being able to determine that.
Very good. And just a comment, I would think that bereavement ministries might want to get a lot of this information and look at how they maybe even handle their ministries. It might be very informative for how that should.
Thanks.
Anyway, thank you for your research.
Thanks.
Yeah, I presented this research this spring at, I'm not going to think of the name of the PLEDA. It was a
Pregnancy Loss and Infant Death Association.
Alliance or something like that. But a nonprofit that is an umbrella for lots of different organizations working in hospitals or ministries or nonprofits on related issues. And it was a wonderful conversation, very, very specific about, and listening to nurses and social workers talk about this was fascinating. When someone experiences a loss and then you walk in the room and then they say this. Just very, very close to the early days of loss. And that was our hope, that our research could feed into that practical work.
Well, and thankfully a lot has changed in the last couple of generations, that there's a lot more training for medical professionals. I think unfortunately this has not made its way to many hospitals. But whereas a couple generations ago people were told not to talk about it, pretend like this didn't happen, there's much more encouragement now for medical professionals, for parents to bond with their baby, to acknowledge the loss of a person, rather than just pushing it aside.
Well, and I think it's actually harder. One of the things I heard at the conference was that it's harder to value the experience of bereaved parents who don't want to hold the baby, don't want to see the baby, don't want to name it, they sort of are doing it in the way that people were encouraged to decades ago. Still, for a variety of reasons, people will not grieve with the intensity that they might be expected to now. So that was a big arena of discussion, was not to project an expectation for the meaning that a person ought to make out of this event, but to give them space to make meaning and grieve in the way that makes sense to them given their set of circumstances.
I think that some of these issues of suffering and death are better understood if we realize that God's direct involvement with the physical world ended with the Big Bang. And then we don't get involved with all sorts of natural phenomena. And, God started it out, and let it run.
I would encourage people who are way over there. I know you're far from the microphone, but if you do have a question, come on over here. And if you have a question but you really don't want to come to the microphone, ask it anyhow from where you are, and we'll just repeat it for the recording. But I have a couple questions. First of all, during the 4 years that you monitored these conversations on this website, did people who were going to the website criticize one another? Did they get into disagreements? Were there any tussles on the site itself? Or was everyone kind of in the same place?
Very rarely, which is also interesting. We think that there's we can get some mileage out of other aspects that we didn't cover in this particular paper. But there was this, what one might call a new ecumenism on this website, that people were very respectful of each other's persuasions. And what people often would open, their particular thread well, this is, I know that everybody sees things differently, but this is how I view it. How do you view it? So there was this very open environment conducive to dialogue, which I think is somewhat characteristic of the web itself, but also particularly characteristic of this particular site.
Of the
Right,
site.
where would you see, an atheist, a witch, an evangelical, and a Buddhist talking about something? I mean, you just don't often have those combinations of people, particularly then also with a shared experience. But not tussling, not arguing, just very much, lots and lots of validation, and then also just I statements, like I see it differently, or I went through that in this way. But it's not about theological or religious discussion per se.
It was also interesting. People would say things like, well, I'm a Christian, I'm a strong Christian, but this experience has made me believe in reincarnation. So all sorts of beliefs that would challenge the tradition's theology on a particular topic, and people felt quite free to express that. Some of it was the anonymity of the site.
But I think also a strength coming from the profundity of the loss, of saying, I have a right to speak to God. I have a right to interpret this on my own. This is just how I see it, and because of what I've gone through, it's how I'm going to see it. So, I mean, there's sort of a strength of voice, I think, that comes through suffering as well.
Well, my second question has to do with, I think it's to you, Jenell Paris. If I remember the stats correctly, it was somewhere around 17 or 18% of the people who were self-identifying as agnostic or atheist, somewhere around like that. What fell apart for them? What was disoriented and then reoriented for people who identified as agnostics or atheists?
I mean, I can think of one story where a person was atheist and was sort of considering faith, saying, this is shaking my atheism, maybe there's more to the cosmos than I thought, and I think came back to their atheism. There was an agnostic who said, people don't take this seriously because it doesn't sound like a crisis of faith, but it is. The way that I thought the structure of the universe was and my place in it, that it didn't work. And that for me is like a crisis of faith.
I don't know if any of you have read the exact replica of A Figment of My Imagination, which is a story of a woman who experiences a stillbirth, and this is the story of her year after this. And she also wrote this interview on the blog, and she's an atheist, but she said that for her, she no longer believes in statistics. That she acknowledges that they're real, but you look at statistics and think, oh, I've got a pretty good chance. But she says she looks at statistics now and it's like, well, I'll probably be that person over there in the 1% because I was in this experience. So it's even that sense of, I have a certain amount of safety. There's certain things I can count on just by living in the world, just throwing that open.
That's very interesting. So because an agnostic could believe in statistics, I have a 1 in 50,000 chance that this is going to happen, and it happens. Mm-hmm. So this is what you're saying.
Right.
So is it safe to say then that for most of the people for whom there was a disorientation, or I forget exactly if that's the term, they were believers of some sort?
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
And there were a number of atheists and agnostics who basically said, see, I told you so. This is why God doesn't exist.
On this site?
Yeah, and not in so many words. I mean, it wasn't that combative sort of stance. But basically, this confirms my sense that there is no higher power, because if so, that higher power is not somebody I want to associate with.
I guess a personal story or experience. I was born in 1987 and was 12 weeks premature. My parents at the time were pretty young, 23 and 24, and had only been married for a few months. And the night of the day that I was born in the evening, the doctor came to my parents and said, he's not going to make it through the night. And, well, he was wrong. I ended up being in the neonatal intensive care unit. This is down at Loyola in Chicago for about 4 months. And came home on my dad's 24th birthday. But, so I guess I've always kind of grown up with the idea, or was told that, well, it was all these prayers that, saved your life. But, then, of course, people who have these, who do lose their children, it's like, well, obviously people were praying just as hard for these babies too. And so it's like, where, I guess, why was my life spared, and why are these other kids not making it? So, I don't know, it's a tough question, and it's something that I have kind of wrestled with the last couple of years. My parents did tell me when I was about 1.5 years that I was very kind of receptive to seeing a crucifix. I would point at it and say things like the Lord, but still that question kind of nags at me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's a beautiful story, and I'm glad you're here. But I think it's generous of you to take your, deep thoughts about your own existence and imagine the situation of someone else. I think many people don't do that. But to think, what I believe about my own life, what I believe about prayer, what sense would that make from some other vantage point, from someone who experienced something different? I think that's generous.
And this is the kind of thing that we found alienated a lot of people, that somebody might give a story like yours and then not think about the other side. And so, and them feeling, not only were they on the outs with God, but also that their story didn't carry the same weight. Because it wasn't, the story where you stand up in front of a crowd and say, guess what, I experienced a miracle. So this sort of double sense of alienation.
Last semester I was in a moral topics class, and we were talking about reproductive loss. And one of the things that really concerned me in a pastoral sense was about the women themselves that were, it's either suffered reproductive loss, or they were just infertile. They couldn't have children. And my concern about those latter was that they did not seem to find a place in the church community. They didn't seem to feel that they belonged to the Christian community in some way. And I think sometimes we Catholics are programmed like, well, you're going to either go to the priesthood, the religious life, or you're going to live as a layperson, or do this, do that. There's some category you fit into. Mm-hmm. And these women did not seem to feel a part of the community. Did y'all have anything to say more about that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't think it directly related to our research, except for there were several parents on the site who were not able to have children after their loss. And so this sense that the infertility is another loss to be grieved. And oftentimes infertility, pregnancy loss, stillbirth, infant death will kind of be considered, along a similar continuum. And yeah, that sense of infertility being a loss that has no social validation for people. It's often completely hidden. And so I think that is another instance. I'm sure that there could be, plenty of similar research done on forums for couples who have struggled with infertility. And that same sense of alienation or loss coming through in religious contexts, not fitting into categories.
I wonder if, well, first of all, thank you. That was very interesting. Lovely to be here with you. I wonder if you notice any tension between the folks that you are describing who have suffered the losses that you're speaking about and other folks who have elected to end pregnancies, because you, Janelle, speak of suffering, the loss of a life. And does that spark some kind of anger or misunderstanding or conflict between those different groups?
That's a good question.
I mean, I can't speak about that in any informed way. I mean, I haven't researched it. It just it seems to me that people experience abortion differently. That it is a meaning-making event, and people make meaning of it in very different ways, and sometimes profound grief and loss, and sometimes not. And just like I was saying, it can be hard for the nurses and social workers in hospitals to understand why someone wouldn't grieve a stillborn baby in the way that they would if it were them. I think it's likewise hard with abortion to understand why people have such a range of experiences. And I hear Christians do this commonly, to say, well, they're in denial. If they were real about it, they'd be experiencing this. They must not really be in touch with it, or they would look at it the way I look at it. I think we can be very ethnocentric, very centered in our own perspective about what other people ought to be interpreting or feeling. But I do think, hopefully, I'm not just doing the same thing by saying this, but it does seem to me that pregnancy termination is, in most cases, a very significant meaning-making event. But I mean, people make that meaning in really different ways.
And there were a few parents on Glow in the Woods who had elected to end pregnancies after a serious prenatal diagnosis. And we didn't include those people in our research, and there were only a handful of them anyway. But so I think for people in that situation where it was a wanted pregnancy, the child had a very grim prognosis, there were people who ended the pregnancy with, in the spirit, they believed, an expression of love. You know, that they weren't prolonging the suffering of their baby anymore, that they were giving them a controlled death rather than, you know, seeing them experience suffering after their birth. And there also are websites dedicated to that type of loss, you know, terminations that happen after a serious prenatal diagnosis. I think just experientially, this is very dicey ground, especially for medical professionals that, you know, for one person, they're seeking termination. For another person, they're seeking validation of their baby as a person. So I think that in some ways it's understandable why this is such, you know, difficult, murky territory for medical professionals.
I was intrigued by your comments on the church year, and just how much of it does focus on children and life and expectancy, and knowing that in my tradition we didn't spend an awful lot of time on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. I learned about that much later. I guess maybe experientially, like what has been helpful in the ways that you move through the church year, and with your own children, how do you move through the church year in a way that that takes into account all of your children, I guess?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me particularly is I often think about the backstory of liturgies. So for instance, at Christmas, I'm thinking about Rachel weeping for her children. I'm thinking about the slaughter of the innocents, and holding that in tension with the birth of Christ. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think Holy Saturday can be a motif that's really strong for a lot of bereaved parents. And that the liturgical year has seasons of life and death. There's growth, there's mourning. In terms of, you know, how we treat the liturgical year with our own children, we have, as a family, we have a number of rituals around our daughter's death. And so I think that is how we remember it more than liturgically, because there's not as much room for expression liturgically. Although I think that, for me personally anyway, All Saints' Day has taken on more significance than what it did in the past.
Janelle number 2. Your early kind of passing comment about it's in the water in American religiosity that we expect God, religion, the divine to keep us safe. Inspires me to tell a quick story of somebody else that may just lead to a question hanging in the air, or maybe something you want to reflect on more about what that water, what it is in the water. My wife and I worked in Central America in the 1980s amid the conflicts, and we had a colleague who worked in El Salvador and also visited some of the Salvadoran refugee camps in Honduras. Susan Clausen is her name. She tells a story of talking with a Salvadoran refugee woman who had been part of kind of an exodus of, I think, about 600 Salvadorans being chased by the military, crossing the river into Honduras. The militaries on both sides kind of surround them. A number of people are shot. She sees her husband. They're trying to swim across to safety. She sees her husband machine gunned and dies. Our friend asks this woman sort of a standard American question, where was God in this? And it's across languages and cultures, and it's probably very much a sort of a peasant woman, so educational differences. So she tries like 2 or 3 different times to ask this question, expecting her to have experienced it as, this deep trial of faith. And finally, she's getting nowhere. She turns it around and says, well, did you experience, where was God in the, instead of where was the crisis, how did you experience God? And the woman lights up and says, oh, we couldn't have survived at all if God hadn't been with us. So what is it, it makes me reflect, what is it about our American culture, and then our religious experience that makes us always expect things to work out. I don't know if that's something for additional research in terms of, anthropology or theology. But it does seem that there is something significant about a kind of American worldview that might be very different from some other cultural, equally Christian, deeply, and other, of course, religions. So I leave that hanging in the air.
Well, that reminds me of some of the research that you did for your, I don't know if you want to talk about that with the community. For this, They Were Stillborn, the story that you opened with there.
Oh. What was that? I wrote a story about my loss. I lost triplet sons 10 years ago. And I wrote a story about them, comparing them to women in a slum in Brazil, in northeast Brazil. This anthropologist, Nancy Shepard Hughes, went to a slum in Brazil as a Peace Corps worker. And there was a woman whose baby had died, and the anthropologist started sobbing. And the mother made fun of her for crying. And Nancy was so taken aback by this. How can mothers not grieve when their infants die? That she went back as an anthropologist and spent a portion of her career studying. The book is called Death Without Weeping. Other than the fact that it's 600 pages long, it's a really, really good book. It takes a long time to read. But what she says is that mothers often don't grieve when their babies die. They sometimes even hasten their baby's death. They deny them what little medical care there is. And when she looked at that from their shoes instead of from her shoes, what she saw was that women have more babies than they can feed. When an infant is born weak and likely to die, you will have more resources for your healthy children if you let that one expire. They immediately interpreted infants as, they would call them red or white. They would label them angels or human. And what they would say was, you don't need to grieve. That baby wasn't a person. That baby was an angel who came for a visit. So they were actually sort of preemptively grieving with their definitions even of what it meant to be human. And Nancy Shepherd Hughes spends the book describing how these babies aren't even counted. They aren't even counted as citizens because the state doesn't count poor people. It doesn't keep track of their births and deaths. And she says these are lives that don't exist socially. And when people are valued so little by their government, when people are so poor, that she just says extreme poverty and political marginalization affects even the deepest of human bonds, even the bond between a mother and baby. And if you were to shift those other variables, simply if people had enough food to give their babies, you would see those cultural interpretations of life shift. But in my own experience, I remember just feeling so alone, and as an American, so cursed. How could a bad thing happen? I mean, it's so obviously, to me, syncretism, right? We bless our wealth with our religion, and the two go hand in hand, and then we're shocked when privilege doesn't happen because we had melded it with our faith. And just the feeling of such aloneness that I had, and at one point, my anthropology brain woke up and said, well, who else on the planet has suffered loss? What other mothers on the planet have lost babies? Tens of hundreds of millions. You're not alone at all. This is actually very, very common. But in my social context, it's very rare. In global context, very common. And looking for then, well, how does the global church interpret suffering? There are just ways of carrying suffering as normal, of handling death and hunger and malnutrition and infant loss, ways of carrying that in faith, that wealthy people are poor in being unable to understand that. So I think for me, connecting my experience out with women and families of other times and other cultures help reduce the isolation I have in a first world context.
Yeah, I think it goes to show, too, how contextualized our discussions about theodicy are.
So I'm curious, around basically the same points about the people who belief had been, if I believe in God, I'll be protected from all harm. Were there people writing on this site who had long since outgrown that, or never bought into that version of a religious life? And what sort of religious disorientation did they express, if there were such people? Because I mean, I don't remember ever believing that myself without having recourse to Wilford's deism necessarily. But I think every valuable conversation I've ever had with anyone who has some faith or some religion, that has not been a part of it. So, but I mean, a blow is still a blow. Anyway.
Right, and I think that what we didn't do was sit down with one person and say, tell me about your experience over a period of years with events happening in order. So we didn't have complete stories or interpretations the way we would have had we done interviews or focus groups or something. So that's just a limitation of the kind of data that we have. Each of our themes, being disoriented, reoriented, searching for meaning, were not 100%. So they were, I mean, maybe half the people were describing a disorientation, or it was around half or more.
I think it was 2/3.
Okay. But we didn't then drill down into the people who didn't have that experience. What were they going through? There certainly were people just saying, I'm sad, this is hard, I want to connect with people. I mean, certainly.
We talked a little bit about, a couple stories of atheists and agnostics. There was another story of a woman who was Buddhist, and, this whole life is suffering, one of the Four Noble Truths. And she really came to balk at that because it was almost, she felt it was like an invalidation of her suffering. It's like, well, this is just life, and accept it. And so it really distanced her from her Buddhism.
I found it interesting but not surprising that you said so many people made their meaning very individualistically. They went off and did whatever. Did you find any folks who've made their meaning by creating a community or by supporting a community? In my experience, that's also one of the ways people make meaning, but maybe our culture or that website didn't elicit that. So, any comments?
Well, I think people who were satisfied with the community they have in their churches or local lives probably weren't trying to form online community. So there's certainly pools of experience that we missed because we were looking at online community. People talked about that website being a very important community of people. And again, you didn't see this as much from people who were 10, 20 years out from their loss, but people within a couple years of loss were touching base frequently with others in the community, following their stories. So I think that did become a really important community.
That in itself would be a way of serving another person by being there online for them.
But the idea of sort of healing through service, I would say I didn't see. I know what you're saying, and I didn't see that very much on that site. Certainly like direct advocacy, people who have losses that they think could have been prevented often find a lot of meaning in trying to help prevent the loss for others. But some people would say that it was sort of, that their loss wasn't preventable or something, then they wouldn't connect in those ways.
We also found that the writing process for a lot of people was also, something that they did with their loss. So logging in the wake of loss itself, some people took on and envisioned it as a spiritual practice.
But I also think that these findings aren't cross-culturally true in the sense that Americans are so individualistic. So every person takes on the full burden of figuring out God and meaning and story. I mean, we've got every single person in society doing this kind of work. Not all societies are like that. So we do find people saying, I need to go off on my own and find my own path and my own voice. I mean, that's a very American approach to meaning making. Not everyone would need that.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I want to say that I think it's a new era, a new world that brings this, and that you two have brought it to us to really see it. I come from a very large family and had a brother that died before I was born. He was 7 years old. He's talked about, remembered. My siblings cry when they talk about him. I feel I know him. There was another child that died in a miscarriage. Never, ever talked about him. Another child, I think, a boy. I don't know if the miscarriage was a boy or girl. Maybe nobody knew. I don't know. Another child that my sister thinks was a boy, had no name, was buried, died as stillborn, was buried on the farm. No talk about it, ever. Now that's unhealthy for a family, to know that there were two people, but they don't exist. There's no record of them in any place in the family. I think what you're doing is bringing this out and saying it's real, these people are real, and thank you. I wish that.
Thank you. Candy McVicker is an advocate here in the Twin Cities. She has an organization called Missing Grace in Rogers. You see it when you drive down 94, it's off on the right. And she was one of the leaders in Minnesota around birth certificate legislation, about women wanting birth certificates for stillborn babies from the state. And what that is that part of who we are as human beings, we exist in relation to others, and our life is recognized by society. We're given a name, we're placed in a descent system and a kinship network. all of that is part of how we know who we are. And one painful thing in grieving is when your baby seems known only to you, maybe not even to your family members, certainly not to society. But Minnesota has been a leading place in asking state governments to recognize stillborn babies by issuing birth certificates to them.
Well, thank you to Janelle and Janelle for this interesting conversation, and thank you for all of you for being here. If you have additional questions, I'm sure both of you might be interested in taking a few questions one-on-one. And thank you for your insight and for your research.
Thank you.